If then you are risen with Christ, seek those things that are above, where Christ sits at the right hand of God. Set your affections on things above, and not on things of the earth. May God bless the reading of the word today. In the letter to the Colossians, Paul tells us to set our minds on things above. And that's actually advice that I think more and more people are willing to listen to today. More and more people are beginning to say that they're not religious anymore, but they're spiritual. And that's what it means to set our minds on things above, to set our minds on spiritual things. But what does that mean? What does it mean to set our minds on spiritual things? I can't answer that question completely, but I want to give you a little outline on the spiritual life. Back in the 80s, there was a book by a Jewish rabbi called Everything I Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Well, I have to confess that everything I know about the spiritual life, I learned from watching The Wizard of Oz. When I was a child, it used to come on every Easter, so for me, maybe there's a connection between The Wizard of Oz and Easter, I'm not sure. But as I looked at the movie, and later as I began preaching, I began to realize that this really is a paradigm for many parts of our life with God. We'll start with the spiritual attributes, and we'll start with the four major characters. Let's take the Scarecrow. What does the Scarecrow want most of all? A brain. There are some people who approach the spiritual life as if it were something to be thought about, as if it was something to be learned. And when they approach it with their heads. I think of Thomas Aquinas, who did this. And if you've ever read any of Thomas Aquinas, and I'm not sure how much I would recommend it, but you can read between the lines that he's loving the things he's writing about. Or my favorite theologian, Karl Barth, who taught in Switzerland and in Bonn, Germany, where I studied for a while. And Barth, the way he writes is he takes a theme and he rides it for a while, and he comes back again and does it again. And somebody said that for him, theology is like surfing. And like a surfer catches a great wave and rides it in, Karl Barth catches a great idea and plays with it and rides it in. And he likes it so much that he swims out and then he does it again. And his theology, reading his theology is like that, going back and going over and over. You realize it's not quite the same wave each time and it keeps moving, but it's an intellectual feast. And for many people, that's the way they approach the spiritual life. For other people, it's a matter of the heart. I think about St. Francis of Assisi or Mother Teresa. I think about Matthew Fox, who finds God in creation. People who are able to feel God deeply, whether it's in service to others, whether it's in communion with nature, or whether it's in silent prayer and contemplation. But they feel God. And if you ask them what they're doing, they'll have a hard time telling you because their spirituality is a deep-set feeling that affects their whole lives and brings them closer to God. That's the tin-man part of spirituality. And then, of course, there's the cowardly lion, who in the end was not much of a coward, because courage is not the fact that you're never afraid. Courage is overcoming your fear to do what you need to do. And again, the lion was able to do that. When I think of these people, I think of some of the great saints of the faith, like Martin Luther, who stood before the whole Catholic Church in opposition to them and for the people, and who said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Or his namesake, Martin Luther King, who stood against both the violence against African Americans in the South, but also stood against using violence. And when some people were saying you need to calm down and be more peaceful, he would say, we are an angry people, and we need to be given the rights that every American has. But when other people told him that he needed to be more aggressive, he said, we are a peaceful people, and we refuse to be violent. For him, the faith was a matter of the will. For Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who stood against the Nazis, stood against Hitler, faith was a matter of the will. And then we have Dorothy. What does Dorothy want? Well, Dorothy wants to go home. And for some people, spirituality is a matter of finding a home, a place to be, a place to settle down. I think of Thomas Merton when I think of someone like this, who lived most of his life in a monastery in Kentucky. Or of the founder of monasticism, St. Benedict, who set out the rules and the order for the monastic life so that people could find a place where there was a spiritual home. Or I think of Clarence Jordan, who established an interracial community based on the principles of peace and justice in rural Georgia in the 1950s and provided a home for people. Dorothy wanted to go home, and for many people their spirituality is about finding a home. Now, as I say this, some of you may be thinking, well, gee, which one am I? Am I a scarecrow? Am I a tin man? Am I a cowardly lion? Or am I Dorothy? Odds are you're a little bit of all four of these characters. Odds are you have all of those attributes. Just because someone approaches theology, spirituality, primarily through theology and thought does not mean that they can't have feelings about God or that they can't have moral courage. Martin Luther King was not only a lion, but he was also a great scarecrow. He was a very learned man, as was Martin Luther. We all have a little bit of these qualities, and in a lot of people we find more of one than the other. And so as we progress in the spiritual life, one of the questions is, which works best for you? Are you spiritually nurtured by reading and by learning more and more about God? Or are you spiritually nurtured by going out in nature, by reaching out to others, or by sitting in contemplation and prayer? Are you nurtured by standing up against injustice and doing what you know is right in the face of overwhelming opposition? Or are you just looking for a home? Probably all of those things, but which one of those predominates most in your life? So one of the things the Wizard of Oz teaches us about spirituality is what I call the 4 spiritual temperaments. And like I said, we each have a part of those temperaments within us, but most of us have one that's more developed than the others. Now, there's another part about spirituality that the Wizard of Oz teaches us, and that's spiritual dysfunctions. We can talk about spiritual temperaments, but if we don't talk about dysfunctions, we're going to miss a major part of what spirituality is all about. We start with the namesake of the movie, the Wizard of Oz himself. Who was the wizard, really? Was he the big head over the throne, the great and powerful Oz? No. He was the man behind the curtain. He was the one who made the image of a great and powerful Oz so that people would be impressed. But in fact, he's just a humble professor of philosophy. He's not as big as he wants others to think he is. And that's one of the spiritual dysfunctions that almost all people need to be aware of. Church kind of sets us up for that if you think about it. We all come and we get all dressed up and we put on our best on Sunday mornings. And I don't know what your life is like, but sometimes I find myself fighting with the kids on the way to church so they'll be quiet so I'll look good when we walk in. We want to look good before God. We want to look good before others. When I just got out of college, I decided to spend my first real Lent in time of intense prayer and fasting. And so on Wednesday mornings, I was planning on going to the chapel on the hill, in the town of Chapel Hill, and spending time in the church in prayer and meditation, and then fasting each Wednesday. And I remember the first Wednesday, I was in the chapel, and I was praying, and I was looking to God, and I remember thinking, wow, people are really going to think you're a spiritual person if you do this. And I began to realize that a lot of what I wanted was not necessarily to be a spiritual person, but to look like a spiritual person. And that's something that I need to fight, and that's something a lot of people need to fight. The essence of spirituality is to be, and not just to seem. And sometimes we have to pretend to be better than we are to get to where we want to be, but the goal is that we be who we are as children of God, and that we are able to put the pretending aside. The second spiritual dysfunction we find in the Wicked Witch of the West. There is evil in the world. And all of us, to some degree, have things in us that I would almost hesitate to call it evil because that might seem like an insult and because the things in our lives never seem that bad. But we've all got parts of our lives that we don't want other people to see, that we have to keep under control sometimes, things that we are almost ashamed of, things that we know are not part of our better selves. We all have those. And part of the spiritual life is taming those things within us. Whether it is a ferocious temper that we need to keep under control, whether it is a dangerous addiction like alcoholism or pornography or drugs or something like that, all of us have something going on inside us. Whether it's just a simple matter of pride and ego or wanting to put others down. Sometimes the evil within us can manifest itself as a sickness. We feel insecure, so we have to put ourselves up. And sometimes in doing that, we put others down. And as we grow in the spiritual life, we find that we deal more and more with those things that are within us that we wish weren't there, that we know are bad, or that we know perhaps may even be evil. We have a little bit of the wicked witch of the West in all of us in some ways. The third spiritual dysfunction that I want to talk about may seem like a strange one. Because I've just talked about the wicked witch of the West and how we all have things in us that are too bad and we need to deal with. But there's also the good witch of the East. And I want to say that she also represents a spiritual dysfunction. Because in reality, no one's that good. No one is that nice. One of the problems as I've been dealing with Presbyterian churches for years is sometimes we're just too polite. Sometimes we're too nice. And by that I mean sometimes we put up with injustices because we don't want to be impolite and call them out. That would be rude of us. In the South, good church folks let the atrocities against African Americans continue because they thought it just wasn't right to stand up and make those people feel bad about what they're doing. One of my mentors, a man named Jim Watson, was trying to help out a church in rural North Carolina. And he was with them, and he figured out what was wrong with the church within the first 20 minutes of the session meeting. They were brainstorming on ideas, the ways they could make the church grow, ways they could make the church healthier. And there was a guy that kind of sat back. He didn't even sit at the table. And every time they'd come up with an idea, he would say, "You do that, and I'm going to leave this church." And it kind of took the wind out of everybody's sails every time he did it. And finally, he did it one too many times, and my friend Jim looked at him and said, "Well, I think it's time you need to go." And everybody in the room was kind of shocked. I mean, we don't say that in our session meeting. I mean, my gosh, we would never kick anybody out of our church. And the man says, "I mean it. I mean it. If you do that, I'm going to go." And Jim says, "Well, this church has to do something, and you're against everything that they want to do, so I think it's time for you to go." And the man said, "I will." And Jim said, "Well, then go. There's the door." And the guy got up and stormed out. After he left, everybody was looking at Jim in shock. They'd never seen anybody kicked out of a meeting before. And Jim looked at them all and he said, "Okay, I know that in a small church, if you lose one member, that can make a big income difference in the church. So the first thing I want to tell you is whatever that man gave to the church, we will more than make up with Presbyterian funding. I'm the one that kicked him out. If he's taking his money with him and going, we'll make sure that you don't suffer that way." And the treasurer raised a hand and said, "Well, he actually never gave more than $1 a week to the church." And Jim says, "Wait a second. You have a man that sits on your session that only gives $1 a week to the church? He didn't look like he was poor." And then somebody else said, "Well, he's not a member of the session. Matter of fact, I'm not even sure he's a member of the church. I don't think he ever really joined." And Jim said, "Wait a second. You have a guy that hasn't even joined your church, and you're letting him bring you down?" They were too nice to tell the man he needed to either change or leave. Now, there are better and worse ways of doing that. But sometimes we just are too polite, and we let things go that ought not to be let go. And when we do that, sometimes that means we don't take the risk to grow in our spiritual lives the way we should. It means that we don't step out in unknown territory, because that's where a lot of faith happens. That's where a lot of growth happens. It means that our spiritual lives will get stunted. I mean, Presbyterians are a nice bunch, and I enjoy that. We're a very friendly group of people. But sometimes we're too friendly, and we tolerate things that we should not tolerate. And that is a spiritual dysfunction. Whether it's tolerating something in our own life or tolerating something in the life of others, and we can do something about it. Now that doesn't mean that we should go around trying to fix everybody's lives, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that a spiritual community just lets everybody do whatever they want to do. We gather together with people and help them. When I graduated from graduate school in journalism, one of the first jobs, most of the afternoon papers in the country really were closing down. And there were very few journalism jobs in newspapers. And so I felt lucky to get a job offer in a bank. And one of the elders in my church called me over while I was in the process of interviewing for this, and I had dinner with him. And he hemmed and hawed for a while, and finally he looked at me and he said, "Murray, I know you, and you have no business working in a bank." And I remember hearing that, and I remember thinking two things. I remember thinking a couple things. First was, he's right. And second was, I need to do this because A, I need a job, and B, I want to prove to my father I can make it in the business world. And so that's what I said. I said, I need a job, and I want to prove to my father that I can cut it in the business world because my father was a businessman. And when he heard that, he backed off and he said, okay. But I appreciated the fact that he took a risk to care for me. He didn't risk being too good and just let it go and let me get into a job that I hated. And in fact, I got the job, I took the job, and I hated the job. Even though it was a good job, it wasn't me. He saw that and he let me know early. So that when I did make the decision to leave the bank and go into ministry, I knew I had the support of someone else. And I told that person that, guess what? I'm going to go to seminary. And he rejoiced with me in that. Now, there are other things that aren't necessarily dysfunctions, and they aren't necessarily spiritual temperaments. And I have to give you a little background on this. I used to give this talk at Hospice. And every time I did, there was a local Episcopal priest named Scott Fisher. And every time I give it, he'd say, well, what about the wizard? What about the good witch? What about the bad witch? And then one session he said, what about the flying monkeys? And I said, well, that's easy. The flying monkeys are the stuff that happens to us in our life, and we got to deal with it. It's not good stuff. It's not our evil stuff. It may not be anybody else's evil stuff, but it's stuff that happens. It's the tornadoes and the hurricanes that sail through life. It's the cancer that hits us or the people we love. It's the accidental, undeliberate deaths of people we love. They're flying monkeys that come into our lives, and these flying monkeys just tear us apart. And it's not like we can do anything about it, and it's not like we can point the finger at anybody and say, it's your fault this happened. It just happens to us. I used to work as a hospital chaplain, and I would see flying monkeys 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes more. People woke up and thought it was going to be a normal day, and then that evening they're standing by the bedside of someone they love, and that person is dying. Or they're in that bed, and they're dying. And that happens to us. And part of the spiritual life is learning to put up with the flying monkeys in our lives. Learning to deal with those things that threaten to destroy us. And in the words of the Apostle Paul, not be undone by them, but to overcome. And that is one of the strongest messages of the gospel that we can have, is that no matter what the world throws at us, through the power of God working within us, we can endure. And we may be hurt, but we will not be destroyed. And then one year Scott said, what about Toto? And I had to think about that one. And then it finally hit me. Why does Dorothy get to Oz? Well, if you remember the movie, Toto bit I think she was a school marm's, got into her and almost bit her. She had to go to her house to get Toto back. And she's riding away, and because she's going after Toto, she's not there in the storm cellar when the tornado hits. She ends up upstairs, and the house is taken up, and she ends up in Oz, and we know the rest of the story. It's because of Toto that she's in Oz in the first place. And of course, the final moment of The Wizard of Oz is when she realizes, when everybody realizes, that the thing they wanted most in life is actually what they already have. The Scarecrow is already smart. The 10 men already had a heart. The lion already had courage. And Dorothy, all she had to do to go home was to click those heels together and say, there's no place like home. And there she was. And I guess that's the big story of the spiritual life, is that everything we really need to grow spiritually, everything we really want in life, we have within us. And if we're waiting for something to happen, then we may be waiting forever because it's already here. Jesus said, the kingdom of God is already among you. Yes, we look forward to it, and so we work for peace, and we work for justice. Yes, it's not as it should be completely now, but nevertheless, the kingdom of God is still among us. And there is justice here, and there is peace here, and it is our job to spread that out. And Dorothy learns that lesson through Toto. Because remember, she was going to go home with the wizard. She was in the balloon and ready to go. Toto sees a cat, jumps out. She jumps out after Toto. The wizard flies away, and there she's stopped. Toto events are those things that happen that they look like flying monkeys. They look like they're really bad. Oh no, my ride is flying home and leaving without me. I'm stuck here forever. And that looks like a flying monkey, but it's a Toto event. It's when things happen to us that are bad things, but in the end they get turned around. And in the end, they're very good things. I've had more than one parishioner come to me after losing their jobs. And we sit and talk, and sometimes the person's devastated by that. But in almost every situation, they're able to find the kind of job that they really wanted. And in reality, they lost their jobs because they didn't love their jobs. And it was a wake-up call for them to get something new. Sitting with people in a divorce can be very, very hard. Because rarely, very rarely is a divorce a time for celebration. And yet, that can be the thing that can bring someone into the relationship that they need to be in. It's a Toto event. Part of the work of spirituality is trying to figure out what's a flying monkey and what's a Toto event. As we live our lives, we have a lot of people trying to tell us what to do and how to be. And heaven knows there's no end of self-help books in any manner of bookstores or online bookstores you go to. If you look at any Kindle, it's probably got some kind of self-help book in it. There's a lot of people that want to tell us how we live our lives, but I find the Wizard of Oz has always been a good guide for me. It's always been a good guide to tell me how to live that spiritual life, to remind me that I have a head and I can worship God with my head, and I have a heart and I can worship God with my heart, and I have a will, the guts to do something, and I can worship God that way, and that God provides me a home to live in. But in that home, there are several things that aren't as they should be. And I should strive to be an authentic self and not a fake version of me. And that those things within me that are evil, I should work and I should fight against. And that sometimes being too good is not good enough. But also to remember that things can happen to me that come out of the blue, undeserved. And there's nothing I can do about them. And I may want to blame it on someone else, but in the end, there's no one to blame it on. And I just have to get through it. But also that some of those things have a little mischievous part to them. A trickster has made them happen. And there are things that bring us closer to God and closer to who God created us to be. May you find your way